The sound of the barn door creaking open in the dead of night made Yates Vernon reach for his rifle before his eyes had fully adjusted to the darkness. November 1878 had brought an early winter to Kennewick, Washington Territory, and the wind howling through the Columbia River Valley carried a bitter cold that could kill a man if he wasn't careful. Yates had survived 3 years running his modest ranch alone since his father passed, and he'd learned to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. Tonight, every nerve in his body screamed danger as he pulled on his boots and grabbed his coat, moving silently through the small ranch house toward the barn. The moon hung low and full, casting silver light across the frost-covered ground as Yates approached the weathered structure where his 2 horses and handful of cattle sheltered from the elements. His breath formed white clouds in the frigid air, and his fingers ached with cold despite the leather gloves he'd hastily pulled on. The barn door stood slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind, and Yates tightened his grip on the rifle as he pushed it open wider. The horses nickered softly, shifting in their stalls, but otherwise the barn seemed undisturbed. Yates scanned the interior, his eyes adjusting to the deeper shadows within. The familiar smell of hay and animal warmth enveloped him, and for a moment he thought perhaps the wind had simply blown the door open. Then he heard it, a soft sound like a wounded animal trying not to make noise, coming from the far corner where he stored extra hay bales. Yates moved forward carefully, rifle raised, until he could see into the shadowed corner. What he found made him freeze in his tracks. Huddled between 2 hay bales, wrapped in nothing but a thin cotton dress that had been fine clothing once but was now torn and mud-stained, was a young woman. She was shivering so violently that her teeth chattered audibly, and her dark hair hung in tangled waves around a face that was pale as death itself. Her eyes, wide and terrified, met his in the dim light, and Yates saw such raw fear in them that he immediately lowered his rifle. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible and cracking with cold and exhaustion. "Please don't send me back." Yates set the rifle against the barn wall and held up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you, miss, but you're going to freeze to death out here. Let me help you inside where it's warm." The woman shrank back against the hay, and Yates could see now that her lips had taken on a bluish tint. Her bare feet, he noticed with alarm, were cut and bleeding, and her hands were wrapped around her body in a futile attempt to preserve warmth. She had been running, he realized, running hard and fast from something or someone with no time to grab proper clothing or shoes. "I can't," she said, her voice stronger now despite the shivers. "He'll find me. He always finds me." "Who will find you?" Yates asked gently, moving no closer but crouching down to make himself less threatening. "My husband," she spat the word like it was poison. "Josiah Orrick. He owns half of Walla Walla and everyone in it. No one will help me because they are all afraid of him." Yates recognized the name. Josiah Orrick was a wealthy cattle baron who had built his empire through ruthless business practices. And, if the rumors were true, violence against anyone who stood in his way. He was at least 30 years older than the young woman shivering before him, and Yates felt his jaw tighten with anger as he began to understand the situation. "You're safe here," Yates said firmly. "I don't care who your husband is or how much money he has. No one is taking you anywhere you don't want to go. But right now, you need to come inside before you die of exposure. We can figure out the rest after you're warm and fed." The woman studied his face for a long moment, searching for signs of deception. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly and tried to stand. Her legs gave out immediately, and Yates caught her before she hit the ground. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, and he could feel her bones through the thin fabric of her dress. How long had she been running? How long since she'd eaten a proper meal? "I've got you," Yates said softly, adjusting his hold to carry her more comfortably. "Just hold on." The woman didn't protest, which told Yates just how desperate her situation was. She pressed her face against his chest as he carried her across the frozen ground to his house, and he could feel the violent shivers racking her body. Once inside, he kicked the door shut behind them and carried her straight to the fireplace, where embers still glowed from the evening fire. He settled her gently into his father's old armchair, the one closest to the hearth, and quickly built up the fire until flames crackled and heat began to fill the room. "I need to get you out of these wet clothes," Yates said, trying to keep his voice professional and calm. "I'll find something of mine for you to wear. Don't worry, I'll turn around." The woman nodded, her shivering now so intense she couldn't speak. Yates hurried to his bedroom and grabbed a clean wool shirt and a pair of long underwear that would be far too big for her but would be warm and dry. When he returned to the main room, he handed them to her and turned his back, keeping his eyes fixed on the wall while he heard the rustle of fabric behind him. "You can look now," she said after a few minutes, her voice muffled by the oversized shirt. Yates turned to find her drowning in his clothes, the shirt hanging to her knees and the sleeves extending far past her hands. Under different circumstances, it might have been comical, but there was nothing funny about the bruises he could now see on her throat and arms, dark purple marks in the shape of fingers. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to remain calm. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "Yesterday morning, I think," she replied, still shivering despite being closer to the fire now. "Or maybe the day before. I'm not sure anymore." Yates moved to his small kitchen area and began pulling out food. Cold cornbread from dinner, a jar of preserved peaches his neighbor had given him, some dried beef, and a jug of milk he kept cool in the cellar. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. He set everything on the small table near the fireplace and gestured for her to eat. The woman fell on the food with barely restrained desperation, and Yates had to stop her from eating too quickly. "Slow down," he said gently. "You'll make yourself sick. Small bites." She nodded and forced herself to eat more slowly, though Yates could see it took tremendous effort. While she ate, he heated water on the stove and brought her a basin to wash her hands and face. Then he knelt beside the chair and examined her feet, which were in worse shape than he'd initially thought. Deep cuts from running barefoot over rough terrain, bruises, and possible frostbite on several toes. "This is going to hurt," Yates warned as he began cleaning the wounds with warm water and the limited medical supplies he kept on hand. The woman bit her lip, but didn't cry out as he worked, carefully removing dirt and debris from the cuts before applying a homemade salve his father had taught him to make from herbs and beeswax. He wrapped her feet in clean strips of cloth, working with the gentle efficiency of someone who had tended his own injuries and those of his animals many times. "Thank you," she whispered when he finished. "I don't even know your name." "Yates Vernon," he said, settling into the other chair by the fire. "And you are Julia," she replied. "Julia Orrick, though I hate that last name more than I can say. How long were you married to him?" Julia's hands tightened around the cup of warm milk Yates had given her. 2 years. "My father owed him money, and Josiah offered to forgive the debt if I would marry him. Father was desperate, our farm was failing, and Josiah promised I would be well cared for." Her laugh was bitter and hollow. "He kept his word about forgiving the debt. Father and mother moved back east with my younger siblings, thinking I was living in luxury. They have no idea what kind of monster they gave me to." Yates waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. At first it wasn't so bad, Julia continued, staring into the fire. He was cold and distant, but I thought that was just his way. Then I found out about the other women he kept, the way he treated the people who worked for him. When I confronted him, he hit me for the first time. She touched her cheek unconsciously. After that, it got worse, much worse. He said I belonged to him, that he owned me like he owned his cattle and his land. When I tried to leave the first time, he found me within hours. He beat me so badly I couldn't get out of bed for a week. "How did you get away this time?" Yates asked quietly. There was a gathering at the house, important men from all over the territory. Josiah was drinking heavily and showing off, not paying attention to me for once. One of the servants, a woman named Ruth who had been kind to me, helped me slip out through the kitchen. She gave me her own shoes, but they fell off while I was running through the woods. I must have run for miles before I saw your barn. I thought maybe I could hide there until morning, then keep moving. Where were you planning to go? Julia's shoulders sagged. I don't know. Somewhere he couldn't find me, though I'm not sure such a place exists. Josiah has connections everywhere. He'll have men looking for me by now, offering rewards. Most people around here would turn me in without a second thought if it meant getting on his good side or earning his money. Well, I'm not most people, Yates said firmly. You can stay here as long as you need. My ranch is small and isolated enough that we should see anyone coming long before they arrive. You don't understand, Julia said, her eyes filling with tears. Josiah will kill you if he finds out you helped me. He's killed men for less. Let me worry about that, Yates replied, though he knew she was probably right. Men like Josiah Orrick didn't get where they were by accepting defiance lightly. Right now, you need rest. You can take my bed. I'll sleep out here by the fire. I can't take your bed, Julia protested weakly. You can and you will, Yates said in a tone that brooked no argument. You've been through hell and back. You need proper rest in a proper bed. Now come on before you fall asleep in that chair. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as her injured feet made walking painful. His bedroom was small but clean, with a simple bed covered in quilts his mother had made before she died when Yates was just a boy. He settled Julia under the covers and made sure she had everything she needed within reach. "Why are you helping me?" Julia asked as he turned to leave. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Yates paused in the doorway, considering his answer. "My mother used to say that we're judged not by how we treat those who can help us, but by how we treat those who need our help. You needed help. That's reason enough." He closed the door softly and returned to the main room, adding more wood to the fire before settling into the armchair with a blanket. Sleep didn't come easily. His mind raced with the complications of the situation he'd just involved himself in. Harboring a runaway wife, especially the wife of a powerful man like Josiah Orrick, could bring serious trouble. In the eyes of the law, Julia was still Orrick's property, and Yates could be charged with theft for keeping her here. But every time he considered turning her away, he remembered the bruises on her throat, the terror in her eyes, and the way she'd whispered, "Please don't send me back." Some things were more important than staying out of trouble. His father had taught him that a man's character was defined by the choices he made when it would be easier to look the other way. Yates had never been one to take the easy path. As dawn light began to filter through the windows, Yates finally dozed off, only to be awakened an hour later by a scream from the bedroom. He was on his feet and through the door in seconds, to find Julia sitting up in bed, her face white and her body shaking. She was still asleep, he realized, trapped in a nightmare. "Julia," he said softly, approaching the bed slowly. "Julia, wake up, you're safe, it's just a dream." Her eyes flew open, wild and unfocused, and for a moment she didn't seem to recognize him. Then awareness flooded back and she pressed her hands to her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I dreamed he found me." "He didn't," Yates assured her. "You're safe here." Julia nodded, but Yates could see she didn't fully believe it. How could she, after 2 years of living in fear? Trust would take time to rebuild, and even then, she might never fully shake the shadow of what she'd endured. "Stay here and rest," Yates said. "I need to tend to the animals, but I'll be close by if you need anything." He left her there and went about his morning chores, feeding the horses and cattle, collecting eggs from his small chicken coop, and checking the property for any signs of visitors. Everything seemed normal, but Yates couldn't shake the feeling that the calm wouldn't last. Josiah Orrick would be looking for his wife, and it was only a matter of time before that search reached this far. When Yates returned to the house, he found Julia had gotten out of bed and was attempting to help prepare breakfast despite her injured feet. She had found an apron and tied it over his oversized clothes and was carefully slicing the bread he'd baked 2 days earlier. "You should be resting," Yates said, though he was secretly impressed by her determination. "I've rested enough," Julia replied. "If I'm going to stay here, even temporarily, I should help out. I'm not helpless, despite appearances." They worked together in comfortable silence, preparing a simple breakfast of eggs, bread, and the last of the preserves. As they ate, Yates found himself studying Julia more carefully. She was probably around 20 years old, with dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and green eyes that held intelligence and strength, despite the fear. Even exhausted and dressed in his old clothes, there was a grace to her movements that spoke of good breeding and education. "Tell me about your ranch," Julia said, clearly wanting to focus on something other than her own situation. Yates obliged, describing his small operation. He had about 200 acres, most of it grazing land for his small herd of cattle. He also grew some wheat and vegetables, enough to support himself with a little left over to sell in Kennewick. It wasn't much, but it was his, and he took pride in what he'd built from the foundation his father had laid. "It sounds peaceful," Julia said wistfully. "I grew up on a farm in Oregon. Nothing fancy, but I loved it. We had cows and chickens and a big garden. Mother would make jam every summer, and Father would let me help with the harvest." Her expression darkened. "Then the drought came, 3 years in a row. The crops failed, the animals started dying, and Father borrowed money to keep us going. That's how we ended up in debt to Josiah." "Do your parents know what happened? How he treated you?" Julia shook her head. "I wrote letters, but Josiah read everything before it was sent. He made me rewrite them until they said exactly what he wanted. As far as my family knows, I'm living in comfort as the wife of a successful businessman. They're proud of the match. They think I saved the family." The bitter irony in her voice cut through Yates like a knife. "You could write them now, tell them the truth." "And say what? That I'm hiding with a stranger while my husband hunts me down. They gave me to him legally. In the eyes of the law and the church, I'm his property until death. Even if they believed me, what could they do? They barely have enough to support themselves." Yates knew she was right, but it didn't make the situation any easier to accept. The law was on Orrick's side, and that was a hard reality to fight against. The day passed quietly, with Yates working around the ranch while Julia rested and slowly regained her strength. He found her in the afternoon sitting by the window, staring out at the rolling hills beyond his property. The view stretched for miles, all the way to the Columbia River in the distance, and Yates had always found it peaceful. But seeing it through Julia's eyes, he wondered if she saw beauty or just another reminder of how exposed they were. "Penny for your thoughts," Yates said, bringing her a cup of tea he'd brewed from herbs. Julia accepted it with a small smile. I was thinking about how strange it is that I feel safer here in a stranger's house than I ever did in the mansion Josiah built. He gave me everything money could buy. Beautiful clothes, jewelry, servants to attend to my every need. But none of it mattered because I wasn't free. I was just a possession in a gilded cage. "You're free now," Yates said. "Am I?" Julia looked up at him with those penetrating green eyes. "Or am I just hiding in a different kind of cage, waiting for the inevitable moment when he finds me?" "Then we'll make sure he doesn't find you," Yates said with more confidence than he felt. "Tomorrow, I'll ride into Kennewick and see what I can learn. Maybe Orrick isn't even looking this direction. Walla Walla is a good distance from here. He might assume you went north toward British Columbia or south toward Portland." Julia nodded, but Yates could see the doubt in her expression. She knew her husband better than Yates did, and if she was this frightened, there was good reason for it. That night, Yates again insisted Julia take the bedroom while he made do with the chair by the fire. He was drifting off to sleep when he heard the bedroom door open softly. Julia emerged, wrapped in one of his quilts, and settled into the other chair. "I can't sleep," she admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him. Can I just sit here with you for a while?" "Of course," Yates said, sitting up straighter. "Do you want to talk about it?" Julia was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying embers of the fire. "The worst part wasn't the hitting," she finally said. "It was the way he made me doubt myself. He would tell me I was stupid, worthless, that no one else would ever want me. He said I should be grateful that he had lowered himself to marry me at all. After a while, I started to believe him. I thought maybe I deserved it, that I had somehow failed to be a good wife." "That's what men like him do," Yates said gently. "They break you down so you won't fight back." "But you did fight back. You ran. That takes courage." "Or desperation," Julia replied. "I was so scared, but I was more scared of what would happen if I stayed." He had started talking about having children, and the thought of bringing a child into that house, raising a son or daughter under his roof, terrified me more than anything. I knew I had to get out before that happened. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Yates found himself studying Julia's profile in the firelight, the delicate curve of her jaw, the determined set of her shoulders despite everything she'd been through. She was stronger than she gave herself credit for, he thought, stronger than most people he'd known. "Can I ask you something?" Julia said suddenly. "Why aren't you married? You have land, a home, you seem like a good man. Surely women around here would be interested." Yates smiled ruefully. "I've been too busy building this place up to think much about courting. My father died 3 years ago and left me with debts and a failing ranch. I've spent every day since then just trying to keep it going. There's a widow in town, Mrs. Patterson, who's made it clear she'd be amenable to a proposal, but I've never felt right about it. She's looking for security, not love, and I guess I've always hoped there might be more to marriage than just convenience." "There should be," Julia agreed. "My parents married for love. They were poor, struggled their whole lives, but they were happy together. That's what I wanted when I was young. I used to dream about falling in love with someone who saw me as an equal, a partner." She laughed bitterly. "Instead, I got Josiah." "You're still young," Yates pointed out. "When this is over, when you're truly free, you'll have a chance at the life you wanted." "Maybe," Julia said, but she didn't sound convinced. "If I survive this, if Josiah doesn't find me first." 3 days passed in a strange domestic rhythm. Yates went about his work while Julia helped where she could, cooking meals and mending his clothes, things that needed doing that he'd been neglecting. Her feet healed slowly, the cuts beginning to close and the bruises fading to yellow and green. She still woke screaming some nights, and Yates would rush in to assure her she was safe. that it was only a dream. On the fourth day, Yates saddled his horse and prepared to ride into Kennewick as he'd promised. Julia watched anxiously from the window as he got ready. "Please be careful," she said. "If anyone asks about me, if there's any talk in town." "I'll be careful," Yates assured her. "Keep the doors locked while I'm gone, and the rifle is loaded and by the door if you need it. I'll be back before dark." The ride to Kennewick took about an hour, and Yates used the time to think through his approach. He needed information without drawing attention to himself or giving anyone reason to connect him to Julia. The town was small, just a few hundred people, but news traveled fast in small communities. Kennewick sat near the confluence of the Columbia and Snake Rivers, a growing town that served as a supply point for ranchers and farmers in the region. Yates tied his horse outside the general store and went inside, nodding to the owner, a man named Henry Walsh who had known his father. "Yates Vernon," Henry greeted him warmly. "Haven't seen you in a while. How's the ranch? Getting by?" Yates replied, selecting some supplies he actually needed to make his visit look legitimate. "Thought I'd stock up before the real winter sets in. How's business?" "Can't complain," Henry said. "Been busy lately. Had some men through here a few days ago asking questions. Unusual types, not farmers or ranchers." Yates felt his stomach tighten but kept his expression neutral. "Oh, what kind of questions?" "Looking for a woman," Henry said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Young, dark hair, pretty. Said she was sick in the head, ran away from an asylum over in Walla Walla. Offering a $50 reward for information leading to her return." $50 was a fortune to most people in these parts, more than many made in months of hard work. Yates felt cold anger building in his chest at Orrick's tactics. By claiming Julia was insane, he'd given people a justification for returning her, made it seem like they'd be helping a sick woman rather than enabling abuse. "That's a lot of money," Yates said carefully. "Anyone see her?" "Not that I heard," Henry replied. "Though between you and me, I didn't like those men. Something off about them. Too smooth, if you know what I mean. The type who'd cut your throat and not lose sleep over it." "Probably best to steer clear then," Yates agreed, paying for his supplies. "Any other news?" Henry launched into local gossip about various neighbors and their doings, and Yates listened patiently while his mind raced. Orrick's men were already in the area, asking questions. It was only a matter of time before they expanded their search and started checking isolated ranches. He needed to get back to Julia and figure out their next move. On his way out of town, Yates stopped by the small church where Reverend Thomas Miller presided. The Reverend was an elderly man who had been a friend of Yates's father, and Yates thought he might be someone who could be trusted with the truth, or at least part of it. "Yates, my boy," Reverend Miller greeted him warmly. Come in, come in. What brings you by?" "I need some advice, Reverend," Yates said, settling into a chair in the small office. "About a moral question." "I'm listening," the Reverend said, his expression growing serious. Yates chose his words carefully. "If you knew someone was being hurt, kept against their will by someone powerful, what would be the right thing to do, knowing that trying to help them could bring serious trouble on yourself?" Reverend Miller studied him for a long moment. "This isn't a hypothetical question, is it?" "No, sir, it's not." The Reverend sighed and leaned back in his chair. "The easy answer is to say you should always help those in need, that doing right is more important than avoiding trouble. But I've lived long enough to know that moral certainty is a luxury most people can't afford." "Are we talking about the woman those men are looking for?" Yates hesitated, then nodded. "I found her, Reverend. She's hurt, terrified, covered in bruises. She begged me not to send her back. What was I supposed to do, turn her away to freeze to death or get dragged back to a man who beats her?" Josiah Orrick, the Reverend said, his face darkening. I've heard stories about that man, nothing proven but enough smoke to assume fire. The problem is, legally, she's his wife. The law won't protect her, and most people will side with him because of his money and influence. So what do I do? That's between you and your conscience, son, Reverend Miller said. I can't tell you what's right in this situation because there are no good options. But I will say this: evil flourishes when good men do nothing. If that woman came to you for help and you turned her away, you'd have to live with that choice for the rest of your life. Can you do that? No, Yates said without hesitation. I can't. Then I think you have your answer, the Reverend said gently. But be careful, Yates. Josiah Orrick is a dangerous man, and he won't take kindly to anyone interfering in what he considers his business. If you're going to stand against him, you need to be prepared for the consequences. Yates thanked the Reverend and headed home, his mind heavy with the weight of the decision he'd made. He'd known from the moment he found Julia that helping her would be complicated, but hearing it confirmed made the danger feel more real. Still, he couldn't bring himself to regret his choice. Some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight seemed impossible to win. When he arrived back at the ranch, he found Julia sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale with worry. She looked up as he entered, searching his expression for news. They're looking for you, Yates said, setting down his supplies. Men working for your husband. They're telling people you escaped from an asylum, offering $50 for information. Julia's face crumpled. I knew he'd come after me. $50 is more than most people see in months. Everyone will be looking for me now. Not everyone, Yates corrected. Some people value doing right more than they value money. We just need to be smart about this. Stay out of sight when anyone comes around, and we'll figure out a longer-term solution. What kind of solution? Julia asked desperately. There's nowhere I can go that Josiah won't eventually find me. He has too many resources, too many connections. Maybe I should just go back. At least then you'd be safe. No, Yates said firmly, moving to crouch in front of her chair so they were eye level. You're not going back to that. We'll find another way. Why do you care so much? Julia asked, tears streaming down her face. You don't know me. This isn't your problem. Yates reached out hesitantly and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Maybe it wasn't my problem 4 days ago, but it is now. I'm not going to let him hurt you again. Something shifted in that moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Julia's hand came up to cover his where it still rested against her cheek, and Yates felt his heart rate quicken. He'd thought Julia was beautiful from the first moment he saw her, but now, seeing the strength and vulnerability in her eyes, he realized his feelings went deeper than simple attraction. Yates, Julia whispered, and the way she said his name made something in his chest tighten. He pulled back gently, not trusting himself to stay that close. We should eat, he said, his voice rougher than intended. I'll make something. Over the next week, they fell into a careful dance around each other and the growing feelings neither of them quite knew how to address. Julia's nightmares became less frequent, and the haunted look began to fade from her eyes. She smiled more, laughed at Yates's stories about ranch mishaps, and slowly began to trust that she was truly safe here. Yates found himself looking forward to coming back to the house after working outside, knowing Julia would be there with a warm meal and easy conversation. She was intelligent and curious, asking questions about everything from how to care for cattle to the history of the area. In turn, she told him about her life before Josiah, about growing up on the farm in Oregon, her dreams of becoming a teacher someday. I loved learning, she said one evening as they sat by the fire. I was good at it too. The school teacher in our town said I had real potential, that I could go to a teaching college if we could afford it. Of course, we couldn't, And then Father needed me to marry Josiah, so that dream died. Maybe it doesn't have to stay dead, Yates suggested. When this is over, you could still pursue that, Julia smiled sadly. I'm 20 years old and legally married to a man who will never let me go. That dream is as dead as they come. You're also smart, brave, and stronger than you think, Yates countered. Don't give up on your dreams just because the path got harder than you expected. Their eyes met across the firelight, and Yates saw something in Julia's expression that made his breath catch. Before he could analyze it, she looked away, color rising in her cheeks. You're a good man, Yates Vernon, she said softly. I don't know what I did to deserve your help, but I'm grateful for it every single day. You don't need to deserve help, Yates replied. You just need to need it, and I needed to give it. The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken emotions, until Julia stood abruptly. I should get some sleep, she said, though it was clear she was running from the intensity of the conversation rather than actual tiredness. Yates let her go, watching as she disappeared into the bedroom and closed the door. He sat by the fire for a long time afterward, trying to sort through the tangle of feelings in his chest. He was falling in love with Julia, he realized. Somewhere between finding her shivering in his barn and sharing quiet evenings by the fire, she had gone from being a woman who needed his help to being someone he couldn't imagine living without. But what kind of future could they possibly have? She was married, and even if they could somehow get around that legal fact, Josiah Orrick wasn't going to just let her walk away. The man had the money and power to make both their lives miserable, or worse, to end them entirely. Yates had no illusions about what men like Orrick were capable of when their pride was wounded. 2 weeks after Julia had arrived, Yates was outside repairing a section of fence when he saw riders approaching in the distance. 3 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful pace of people on a mission. Yates felt his blood run cold. He dropped his tools and ran for the house, bursting through the door to find Julia kneading bread dough at the table. Riders coming, he said urgently. 3 of them. Get in the bedroom and stay quiet no matter what you hear. Julia's face went white, but she didn't hesitate. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. Yates took a moment to compose himself, then grabbed his rifle and stepped outside just as the riders reached his property. The 3 men were exactly what Yates had expected. Hard-faced professionals who made their living through intimidation and violence. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down one cheek, reined in his horse a few yards from where Yates stood. Afternoon, the man said, though his tone held no warmth. Name's Garrett. We're looking for a woman who went missing a few weeks back. Young, dark hair, pretty. Her husband is awful worried about her, especially since she's not right in the head. You wouldn't have seen anyone like that around here, would you? Can't say I have, Yates replied evenly, keeping the rifle pointed at the ground but ready to raise it if needed. I'm out here alone most of the time. Don't get many visitors. Garrett's eyes swept over the property, taking in every detail. Mind if we have a look around, just to be thorough. Her husband is offering a generous reward for her safe return. I do mind, actually, Yates said, his voice hardening. This is my property, and I don't take kindly to strangers searching it without cause. Now see, that makes me curious, Garrett said, his hand moving subtly toward the gun at his hip. A man with nothing to hide usually doesn't object to a simple look around. Makes me think maybe you're hiding something after all. Think what you want, Yates said, raising the rifle slightly. But you're not searching my property without a warrant, and I don't see a sheriff with you. So I suggest you move along. The tension stretched tight as a wire about to snap. Garrett's 2 companions shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. Yates knew he was outgunned and probably outskilled when it came to a fight, but he also knew that giving ground now would be the end of everything. "You're making a mistake," Garrett said coldly. "Mr. Orrick doesn't forget people who get in his way." "Then I guess I'll have to live with that," Yates replied. "Now get off my land." For a long moment nobody moved. Then Garrett smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll be back," he promised. "And next time we'll bring the sheriff." Hard to object to a search when there's legal authority behind it. The three men turned their horses and rode away, but Yates knew this was far from over. He waited until they were completely out of sight before lowering the rifle and heading back inside. Julia emerged from the bedroom, her face pale and her hands shaking. "They're going to come back," she said. "With the sheriff. What are we going to do?" Yates set the rifle down and ran his hands through his hair, thinking hard. "The sheriff in Kennewick is Thomas Bryant. He's a decent man, but he's also sworn to uphold the law. If Orrick claims you're his wife and you ran away, Bryant will have to return you. We need to figure out our options before they come back." "There are no options," Julia said dully. "This is over. I should leave now, tonight, before Josiah's men come back with legal authority. At least that way you won't be charged with harboring me." "You're not going anywhere," Yates said. "It's already winter. You barely survived getting here. Where would you even go?" "I don't know," Julia admitted, tears streaming down her face. "But I can't stay here and watch Josiah destroy you for helping me. I won't do that." Yates crossed the room and pulled her into his arms without thinking. Julia stiffened for a moment, then collapsed against him, sobbing into his chest. He held her tight, one hand stroking her hair while he murmured reassurances he wasn't sure he could keep. "We'll figure this out," he said. "I promise you, Julia, we'll find a way." Julia pulled back slightly to look up at him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Why are you doing this? Really? It can't just be because it's the right thing to do. You're risking everything for me." Yates looked down at her, at this strong, broken, beautiful woman who had somehow become the center of his world in just 2 weeks. "Because I'm in love with you," he said simply. "I know it's fast. I know the timing is terrible. I know we barely know each other. But I am. I love you, Julia, and I'm not going to let him take you back." Julia's breath caught, her eyes searching his face. "Yates, I'm married. Even if we both want something different, the law says I belong to Josiah. Loving me will only bring you pain." "Then I'll take the pain," Yates said. "But I won't give you up without a fight." Julia reached up and touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I didn't think I could ever feel this way about anyone, especially not after Josiah. But you make me feel safe, valued, like I matter as a person and not just a possession. I've never had that before." Yates leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. Instead, Julia rose on her toes to meet him halfway. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and tentative at first, then deeper as 2 weeks of unspoken longing poured out. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "This doesn't solve our problems," Julia said, though she made no move to leave the circle of his arms. "No," Yates agreed, "but it gives us a reason to find solutions instead of giving up." That night they sat up late making plans. Their options were limited and none were particularly good. Julia could keep running, but winter was setting in hard and she'd likely freeze to death before finding safety. They could try to fight Orrick legally, but the law was on his side and they didn't have money for lawyers. Or they could leave together, abandon Yates's ranch and head for somewhere Orrick's influence didn't reach, though that meant giving up everything Yates had worked for. "There might be one other option," Yates said slowly. "It's a long shot, but it might work. In the Oregon Territory, there's talk of new laws being passed about marriage. I heard some men discussing it in town a while back. Something about wives being able to petition for divorce in cases of extreme cruelty. Oregon's laws are more progressive than Washington territory. But I'm not in Oregon, Julia pointed out. And even if I was, divorce proceedings take time. Josiah would find me long before any case could be heard. Not if we could get you to Portland and find a lawyer willing to work fast, Yates argued. Portland is big enough that you could disappear into the population while the case moves forward. It's not perfect, but it's a chance. It's also expensive, Julia said. Lawyers cost money and I don't have any. Everything I own belonged to Josiah. I've got some money saved up, Yates said. It's not much, but it might be enough to get things started, and I could sell some cattle, liquidate some assets. I can't ask you to do that, Julia protested. Your ranch is your life. My ranch is wood and land, Yates countered. You're my life now, Julia. I'd rather be poor and with you than comfortable and alone. Julia's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of hope rather than despair. You really mean that? Every word, Yates confirmed. They spent the rest of the night planning in detail. Yates would take Julia to Portland, get her established somewhere safe, and find a lawyer willing to take her case. It would mean leaving his ranch for an extended period, which worried him, but his neighbor Daniel Morrison was a good man who would look after the place in exchange for a share of any profits. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best shot. The next morning, Yates rode to the Morrison ranch to explain the situation, or at least as much of it as he felt safe sharing. Daniel was a few years older than Yates, a steady man with a wife and 3 children who had always been friendly neighbors. I need to ask a big favor, Yates said after they'd exchanged greetings. I have to go away for a while, maybe a few months, and I need someone to watch over my place while I'm gone. Keep the animals fed, maintain the property, that sort of thing. I can pay you with half the profits from any cattle sales while I'm away. Daniel studied him thoughtfully. This have anything to do with those men who came through asking questions about a missing woman? Yates hesitated, then decided Daniel deserved at least a partial truth. It does. I found someone who needed help and now I'm helping them. That's all I can say. The woman they're looking for, Daniel said. It wasn't a question. The one supposedly escaped from an asylum. She's not crazy, Yates said firmly. She's running from a man who hurt her. That's the truth. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. I figured it was something like that. Those men didn't seem like the type who'd be chasing after a sick woman out of concern for her welfare. More like the type who get paid to bring back property, if you catch my meaning. So you'll help. I will, Daniel agreed. But you need to know that Sheriff Bryant came by yesterday. He's planning to visit your place tomorrow with those men to do a legal search. If she's there, they'll find her. Yates felt his heart sink. Tomorrow didn't give them nearly enough time. I appreciate the warning, he said. We'll be gone before he arrives. Good luck, Yates, Daniel said, shaking his hand. Whatever you're doing, I hope it works out. Nobody deserves to be dragged back to a situation that bad against their will. Yates rode home quickly and found Julia packing what little she had into a small bag. We need to leave today, he told her. The sheriff is coming tomorrow. Julia nodded, her face set with determination. I'm ready. What do we need to do? They spent the afternoon preparing for the journey. Yates packed supplies, food, blankets, and everything they'd need for the long trip to Portland. He saddled both horses and made sure they were well fed and ready for hard travel. He wrote a note for Daniel with instructions for the ranch and left it where his neighbor would find it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Yates and Julia mounted their horses and took one last look at the ranch. Yates felt a pang in his chest at leaving the place his father had built, the home he'd worked so hard to maintain. But then he looked at Julia, sitting straight and brave on the horse beside him despite her fear, and knew he was making the right choice. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," Julia replied. "Let's go." They rode through the night, heading southwest toward Oregon. The journey would take several days, and they needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Josiah's men before anyone realized they were gone. The temperature dropped steadily as night deepened, and Yates could see Julia shivering despite the heavy coat he'd given her. Around midnight, they stopped to rest the horses and warm themselves. Yates built a small fire in a sheltered spot and made coffee from the supplies he'd packed. They sat close together, sharing the warmth of the flames and each other. "Tell me about Portland," Julia said. "I've never been there." "It's big," Yates replied. "Maybe 15,000 people now and growing fast. It sits on the Willamette River, right where it meets the Columbia. Lots of shipping, lots of business. A person could disappear there if they wanted to, especially a woman on her own." "I won't be on my own," Julia pointed out. "You'll be there." "For as long as you need me," Yates agreed. "But Julia, you need to understand what we're doing here. If we go through with this, if you petition for divorce, it's going to create a scandal." Divorce isn't common, especially when the husband is wealthy and respected. Josiah will fight it with everything he has, and he'll try to destroy your reputation in the process. People will say terrible things about you. "Let them," Julia said fiercely. "I don't care what people I've never met think about me. I care about being free. I care about having a chance at a real life, maybe with you if you'll still want me after all this is over." "I'll always want you," Yates said, pulling her close. "No matter how long this takes or how hard it gets, I'll be here." They held each other for a while, drawing strength from their shared warmth and determination. Then they extinguished the fire and rode on, pushing through the darkness toward hope and freedom. The next several days passed in a blur of hard riding and cold camps. They avoided towns and main roads, sticking to less traveled paths where they were less likely to be spotted. Yates had enough experience with the territory to navigate by landmarks and instinct, and Julia proved to be a capable rider despite her earlier injuries. On the third day, they crossed into Oregon territory and began to breathe a little easier. Josiah's influence didn't reach as far here, though Yates knew they couldn't get complacent. Men with enough money could buy cooperation anywhere. "How are you holding up?" Yates asked as they made camp that evening. "Better than I expected," Julia admitted. "My body hurts from all the riding, but my heart feels lighter than it has in years." "Is that strange?" "Not strange at all," Yates replied. "You're taking control of your life. That's worth celebrating even if it's hard." That night, sheltered in a small grove of trees with a fire crackling between them, Julia reached across and took Yates's hand. "When this is over," she said, "when I'm free, I want to marry you properly. Not because I have to, not because of debts or obligations, but because I choose to. Because I love you and want to build a life with you." Yates's throat tightened with emotion. "Nothing would make me happier," he managed to say. "Though I have to warn you, life with me won't be easy. I'm just a rancher with a small spread. I can't give you the luxury Josiah did." "I don't want luxury," Julia said. "I want partnership. I want someone who sees me as an equal, who values my thoughts and opinions. I want to wake up next to someone I'm not afraid of. That's worth more than all the money in the world." They kissed then, a long, slow kiss that spoke of promises and hope, and all the possibilities their future might hold. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling despite the hardships still ahead. 5 days after leaving Yates's ranch, they finally reached the outskirts of Portland. The city sprawled along the river, a bustling hub of activity even in the grip of winter. Wooden buildings lined muddy streets, and the air smelled of smoke and commerce and possibility. Yates found them a small boarding house on the edge of the city, run by a sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Catherine Brennan, who asked few questions as long as the rent was paid. He took 2 rooms, keeping up the appearance of propriety even though Julia would have been happy to share one. "We need to be careful about your reputation," Yates explained. "If word gets back to Josiah that we've been living inappropriately, it could hurt your case for divorce." Julia understood, though she hated being separated from Yates even by a thin wall. After weeks of having him nearby, his presence had become a comfort she relied on. The next step was finding a lawyer willing to take Julia's case. This proved more difficult than they'd anticipated. The first 3 lawyers they approached refused as soon as they heard Josiah Orrick's name. The fourth, a young, ambitious man named Robert Hayes, listened to their story but explained that without significant evidence of abuse, divorce cases were nearly impossible to win. "Oregon's laws are more progressive than many territories," Hayes explained, "but they still favor husbands in marital disputes. You'd need witnesses, medical documentation of injuries, something concrete to prove the abuse occurred. Even then, if Mr. Orrick contests the divorce, which he certainly will, the case could drag on for years." "What if I testify?" Julia asked. "What if I tell the court exactly what he did to me?" "Your testimony alone won't be enough," Hayes said gently. "The law sees wives as potentially biased against their husbands. You'd need corroboration from someone else, preferably someone respected in the community." Julia felt hope draining away. Most of the people who had witnessed Josiah's abuse were his servants, and they'd never testify against him for fear of losing their positions or worse. Yates, seeing her despair, spoke up. "What about medical evidence?" he asked. "When I found Julia, she had extensive bruising. I saw the marks on her throat and arms. Would that count?" "It could," Hayes said, "but it would need to be documented by a physician, and the injuries would need to be recent enough to be visible." "How long ago was this?" "Almost 3 weeks, Yates said, his heart sinking. The bruises had faded significantly since then. Hayes looked sympathetic but firm. "I'm sorry, but without better evidence, I can't in good conscience take this case. You'd be spending money with little chance of success, and once Mr. Orrick realizes what you're attempting, he'll make your lives very difficult." They left Hayes's office dejected and returned to the boarding house in silence. Julia sat on the narrow bed in her room and stared at the wall, her earlier hope replaced by grim resignation. "Maybe I should just keep running," she said. "Head north to British Columbia or even Alaska. Josiah's reach has to end somewhere." "And what kind of life would that be?" Yates asked. "Always looking over your shoulder, always afraid. You'd be trading one kind of prison for another." "At least I'd be free of him," Julia countered. "And you could go home, get back to your life without me dragging you down." Yates knelt in front of her and took both her hands in his. "Listen to me. You are not dragging me down. You're the best thing that's happened to me in years. We just need to think this through and find another approach." "What other approach?" Julia asked hopelessly. "The law is on his side, money is on his side, power is on his side, we have nothing." "We have the truth," Yates said, "and we have each other. That has to count for something." Over the next week they tried everything they could think of. Yates visited newspaper offices, thinking public opinion might help. But no one wanted to risk libel charges by publishing accusations against Josiah Orrick without proof. They sought out women's groups and charitable organizations, but while sympathetic, none had the resources or influence to challenge a man of Orrick's stature. Meanwhile, money was running low. The boarding house rent, Food and other expenses were eating through Yates's savings faster than he'd anticipated. He took odd jobs around the city when he could find them, hauling cargo at the docks or helping with construction, but it wasn't enough. Julia found work as well, taking in sewing and mending from some of the wealthier households. It paid little, but every bit helped. They fell into a routine, working during the day and spending evenings together, planning and hoping for a breakthrough that never seemed to come. One evening, about a month after arriving in Portland, Yates returned to the boarding house to find Julia in animated conversation with Mrs. Brennan. The widow's expression was thoughtful as she listened to Julia's story, and when Yates entered, both women looked up. "Mr. Vernon, Mrs. Brennan said, "Julia has been telling me about her situation. I'd like to help if I may." "Any help would be appreciated," Yates said cautiously, "but I'm not sure what you could do." Mrs. Brennan smiled. "You'd be surprised what a woman with connections can accomplish. My late husband was a judge here in Portland before he passed 5 years ago. I still know people in the legal community, including some who might be willing to take Julia's case if I vouch for her character." Hope flickered in Yates's chest. "Would they really listen?" "Perhaps," Mrs. Brennan said. "But more importantly, I can testify on Julia's behalf. I've been watching her for weeks now. I've seen the nightmares, heard her crying at night. I've seen how she flinches when men speak too loudly or move too quickly. That's not the behavior of a woman who left her husband frivolously. That's the behavior of a woman who's been traumatized." "You'd be willing to testify in court?" Julia asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "I would," Mrs. Brennan confirmed. "I've lost count of how many women I've seen trapped in terrible marriages with no way out. If I can help even one escape that fate, it's worth whatever inconvenience it causes me." With Mrs. Brennan's support, they approached another lawyer, an older man named Marcus Webb, who had been friends with her late husband. Webb listened carefully to their story, reviewed what evidence they had, and agreed to take the case. "It won't be easy," Webb warned. "Mr. Orrick will fight this with everything he has. But with Mrs. Brennan's testimony, your testimony, and Mr. Vernon's account of finding you in the condition you were in, we might have enough to convince a judge that staying in the marriage would cause you serious harm. That's the legal standard we need to meet." The divorce petition was filed in early January of 1879, and as Webb had predicted, Josiah Orrick's response was swift and vicious. His lawyers filed counter-motions claiming Julia was mentally unstable, that she had run away in a fugue state, that Yates had kidnapped and corrupted her. They demanded Julia be returned to her husband's custody immediately pending the outcome of the case. The judge, a stern man named Harrison Ford, denied the request for immediate custody but scheduled a hearing for late February. In the meantime, Julia was to remain in Portland under the supervision of Mrs. Brennan, and she was forbidden from having contact with Yates except in public settings with a chaperone present. The separation was agony for both of them. Yates moved to a different boarding house to comply with the court's orders, and they were limited to brief, supervised meetings once a week. Each visit felt too short, and Yates left feeling empty and frustrated. The hearing, when it finally arrived, was grueling. Josiah Orrick himself attended, sitting in the courtroom with an expression of wounded dignity. He was in his early 50s, handsome in a cold way, with silver-streaked hair and expensive clothes that spoke of wealth and status. When his eyes met Julia's across the courtroom, she physically recoiled, and Yates had to restrain himself from crossing the room to comfort her. Josiah's lawyer painted Julia as an ungrateful, hysterical woman who had abandoned her devoted husband without cause. They produced character witnesses who spoke of Josiah's generosity and standing in the community. They suggested Julia had been seduced away by Yates, a poor rancher with nothing to offer except empty promises. When it was their turn, Webb presented Julia's testimony. She spoke clearly and calmly about the abuse, describing specific incidents in detail. She showed the faint scars that remained from some of the beatings. She explained about the isolation, the control, the constant fear that had defined her marriage. Mrs. Brennan testified about Julia's condition when she first arrived at the boarding house, about the nightmares and fear responses that no acting could fake. Yates testified about finding Julia in his barn, about the bruises and injuries, about her desperate plea not to be sent back. The hearing lasted 3 days. At the end, Judge Ford announced he would take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling within 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks felt like an eternity. Julia barely slept, and Yates wore a path in the floor of his boarding house room from pacing. Finally, the day came. They gathered in the courtroom, Julia pale and shaking, Yates wishing he could hold her hand but separated by the court's restrictions. Josiah sat with his lawyers, confident and composed, clearly expecting victory. Judge Ford entered and took his seat. "This has been one of the most difficult cases I've presided over," he began. "The law clearly favors the preservation of marriage. However, the law also recognizes that there are circumstances under which continuing a marriage would cause irreparable harm." He looked directly at Julia. "Mrs. Orrick, I've reviewed all the evidence presented, and I've listened carefully to your testimony. While Mr. Orrick's lawyers argue that you're unstable or manipulated, I see a young woman who displayed remarkable courage in escaping a dangerous situation. The physical evidence of abuse, combined with the credible testimony of witnesses, convinces me that your claims are truthful." Hope surged in Julia's chest, but she didn't dare breathe yet. "However," Judge Ford continued, "I must also consider the seriousness of dissolving a legal marriage. Therefore, my ruling is as follows. I am granting a decree of divorce on the grounds of extreme cruelty. The marriage between Julia Orrick and Josiah Orrick is hereby dissolved." The courtroom erupted. Josiah's lawyers immediately began objecting, demanding appeals. Josiah himself stood, his face purple with rage, and had to be restrained by the bailiff as he lunged toward Julia. But none of it mattered because the words had been spoken. The marriage was dissolved. Julia collapsed into sobs of relief, and Mrs. Brennan wrapped her arms around the younger woman. Yates, from across the room, felt tears streaming down his own face. They had won. Against all odds, they had actually won. The legal restrictions on their contact were lifted immediately, and Yates crossed the courtroom in 3 strides to pull Julia into his arms. She clung to him, shaking with emotion while he held her tight and whispered reassurances. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "You're free. He can never hurt you again." Josiah was still raging, being forcibly removed from the courtroom by the bailiff, but Julia didn't even look at him. Her nightmare was over, and she was finally, truly free. The next few weeks passed in a blur of relief and adjustment. Julia legally changed her name back to her maiden name, Julia Owens, shedding the last remnant of her marriage to Josiah. They heard through the grapevine that Josiah had filed an appeal, but Webb assured them it was unlikely to succeed given the evidence and Judge Ford's thorough ruling. With the legal battle behind them, Yates and Julia could finally focus on their future. They spent long hours talking about what they wanted, where they wanted to live, what kind of life they wanted to build together. "I should go back to my ranch," Yates said one evening as they walked along the Willamette River. "I've been away for months now. Daniel's done his best, but it needs proper attention." "Then we'll go back together," Julia said, slipping her hand into his. "If you'll have me." "If I'll have you," Yates laughed. "Julia, I've been waiting for you to be free so I could properly court you. Though I suppose we've been doing things backward from the start." "Then let's keep doing things our way," Julia suggested. "We don't have to follow anyone else's timeline or expectations. We've earned the right to make our own choices." In March of 1879, they were married in a simple ceremony at the Portland courthouse with Mrs. Brennan and Marcus Webb as witnesses. Julia wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Brennan had helped her make, and Yates wore his best suit, which was still rather worn but clean and pressed. There were no flowers, no fancy reception, no crowds of guests. But when Yates slipped the simple gold band onto Julia's finger and kissed her as his wife, it was the happiest moment of either of their lives. They spent their wedding night at a modest hotel in Portland, finally able to be together properly after months of separation and restraint. Julia was nervous, her experiences with Josiah having left her with understandable fear about physical intimacy. But Yates was patient and gentle, letting her set the pace, showing her that love could be tender instead of painful. "I never thought I could feel like this," Julia whispered afterward, lying in Yates's arms. "Safe and loved and cherished. Thank you for being patient with me." "Always," Yates promised, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We have the rest of our lives to learn each other. There's no rush." In early April, they finally made the journey back to Kennewick. The ranch looked different to Yates's eyes after months away, smaller somehow but also more precious. Daniel Morrison had done an excellent job maintaining things, and the cattle had survived the winter in good condition. "Welcome home," Daniel said warmly, shaking Yates's hand and nodding respectfully to Julia. "I heard about what happened, about the court case. Congratulations to you both." "Thank you," Julia said, "and thank you for taking care of everything here. It means more than you know." "Happy to help," Daniel replied. "Neighbors look after each other out here. That's how things work." As promised, Yates split the profits from the cattle Daniel had sold over the winter, and his neighbor departed with a friendly wave. Finally, alone, Yates and Julia stood looking at the small ranch house that would be their home. "It's not much," Yates said, suddenly self-conscious about how modest everything was compared to what Julia had known. "It's perfect," Julia corrected, taking his hand. "It's ours, and we chose it freely. That makes it worth more than any mansion ever could be." They settled into married life with surprising ease. Julia proved to be an excellent rancher's wife, not afraid of hard work and quick to learn the skills she didn't already possess. She tended the garden, cared for the chickens, and helped Yates with the cattle when needed. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk about their days, making plans for the future. Julia's nightmares gradually faded, though they never disappeared entirely. But now, when she woke gasping and afraid, Yates was there to hold her and remind her that she was safe. Over time, the good dreams began to outnumber the bad. In June, they received word that Josiah's appeal had been denied. The divorce was final and binding. Julia cried when she heard the news, tears of relief and joy and gratitude that her ordeal was truly over. "I need to write to my parents," she said. "They should know the truth about what happened, about where I am now." She composed a long letter explaining everything, from her marriage to Josiah to her escape to the divorce and her marriage to Yates. She didn't know what response to expect, if any, but she needed her family to know the truth. To her surprise and delight, her mother wrote back within a month. The letter was full of apologies and regret for having pushed Julia into marriage with Josiah, and joy that she had found happiness with Yates. Her parents were living in Ohio now, having moved east with Julia's younger siblings. They invited Julia and Yates to visit whenever they could make the journey. "Someday," Julia said, holding the letter like it was precious treasure. "When we can afford the trip, I want you to meet them properly. I want them to see how happy you make me." "Someday," Yates agreed, pulling her close. "We have all the time in the world now." As summer turned to fall, Julia began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited to be sure before telling Yates, afraid to get his hopes up if she was wrong. But when 2 months had passed with no doubt remaining, she finally shared the news one evening after dinner. Yates's face went through a rapid series of emotions: shock, joy, fear, and fierce protectiveness. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sure," Julia confirmed, smiling through happy tears. "We're going to have a baby, Yates, around March, I think." He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. Then he set her down carefully, suddenly worried about being too rough. "You'll need to see a doctor," he said. "We need to make sure you and the baby are healthy." "I will," Julia promised. "But Yates, I'm happy. Terrified, but happy. After everything that happened with Josiah, I never thought I'd want children, but with you I do. I want to build a family with you." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though winter made things more difficult. Julia's energy flagged as the baby grew, and Yates took over more of the household chores to make things easier for her. He was attentive and protective, sometimes overly so, but Julia found it endearing rather than suffocating because she knew it came from love rather than control. In March of 1880, almost exactly a year after they had married, Julia went into labor. Yates rode frantically to fetch the midwife from Kennewick, a capable woman named Martha Hayes who had delivered half the babies in the area. Martha arrived in time to help Julia through the long hours of labor, coaching her through the pain while Yates paced anxiously in the other room. Finally, as the sun was setting, a baby's cry filled the small house. Yates burst through the door to find Martha cleaning a red-faced, wailing infant while Julia lay exhausted but smiling on the bed. "You have a son," Martha announced, wrapping the baby in a clean blanket. "A healthy boy with a good set of lungs on him." Yates approached the bed carefully, awe-struck at the tiny person Martha placed in his arms. The baby was so small, so perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that would probably change color but were currently a deep blue. "Hello, little one," Yates whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your father." Julia watched them with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed with love and gratitude. After everything they had been through, after all the pain and fear and struggle, they had this beautiful moment. Their son, their family, their life together. "What should we name him?" Yates asked, carefully settling onto the bed beside Julia so she could see their son. "I was thinking James," Julia said. "After your father, James Vernon. What do you think?" "I think it's perfect," Yates said, his throat tight. "James Vernon. Welcome to the world, son." The first months of parenthood were exhausting but joyful. James was a healthy baby with a powerful appetite and an even more powerful set of lungs. Yates discovered reserves of patience he hadn't known he possessed, walking the floor with a crying James at 3 in the morning while Julia recovered from childbirth. Julia, despite her exhaustion, glowed with happiness, finally experiencing the motherhood she'd longed for under circumstances that felt safe and right. As James grew, they marveled at every small development: his first smile, his first laugh, the way he would grasp their fingers with his tiny hands. Daniel Morrison and his wife Sarah became frequent visitors, bringing meals and offering advice from their own experiences with their 3 children. "You're doing well," Sarah assured Julia one afternoon as they sat watching the children play. James was now 6 months old and fascinated by everything around him. "I know it's hard, but you're a natural mother." I don't always feel like it, Julia admitted. Sometimes I worry that I'm doing everything wrong. Every mother feels that way, Sarah said kindly. But look at him. He's healthy and happy and loved. That's what matters. Julia looked at her son, at his bright eyes and ready smile, and felt her heart swell with love. I just want to give him a better childhood than I had at the end, she said. I want him to grow up feeling safe and valued, knowing his parents love each other and love him. Then that's what you'll do, Sarah said. You and Yates have already proven you'll fight for what matters. Your son is lucky to have you both. As James grew into a toddler, the ranch prospered. Yates had worked hard to build up the herd, and good weather had meant successful harvests. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable, with enough to meet their needs and even save a little for the future. Julia started teaching James his letters as soon as he was old enough to show interest, determined that her son would have the education she'd valued in her own childhood. She also began teaching reading and writing to some of the neighbor children whose parents couldn't read themselves, fulfilling her old dream of teaching in a different way than she'd imagined. One evening in the spring of 1882, as they sat on the porch watching 3-year-old James play in the yard with a wooden horse Yates had carved for him, Julia leaned against her husband's shoulder with a contented sigh. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked. "If I hadn't run that night, if I hadn't found your barn." "I try not to," Yates admitted. "It's too terrible to imagine. But sometimes I wake up and look at you sleeping beside me, at James in his room, and I can't believe how lucky I am. You changed my life, Julia. You gave me a family, a purpose beyond just surviving day to day. You saved my life," Julia countered, "and then you gave me a reason to live it. I love you, Yates Vernon." "I love you too," Yates replied, pulling her closer. "Every day more than the day before." They sat in peaceful silence, watching their son play as the sun set over their land. It hadn't been an easy journey to this moment. They had faced fear, danger, legal battles, and countless hardships. But they had faced them together, and that had made all the difference. A few years later, in 1884, Julia gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Alice. James, now 4 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and insisted on helping with everything from fetching diapers to singing her songs when she cried. Alice was a calmer baby than James had been, with Julia's green eyes and a temperament that suggested she would be thoughtful and observant. The ranch continued to grow, and Yates hired a young man from town to help with the work now that they had 2 children requiring attention. Julia's teaching expanded as well, with a small school forming in Kennewick that asked her to teach part-time once Alice was old enough to be left with a neighbor. In 1887, they finally made the trip to Ohio to visit Julia's parents. It was a long journey with 2 small children, but worth it to see the joy on her mother's face when she met her grandchildren for the first time. Julia's parents were older now, her father's health declining, and Julia was grateful they had made the trip while he could still enjoy it. "You've done well," her father said to Yates one evening while they sat on the porch of her parents' small house. "My daughter is happy, healthy, clearly loved. I made a terrible mistake giving her to Josiah Orrick, but you've given her the life she deserved. Thank you for that." "Julia's strength and courage got her through," Yates replied. "I just gave her a safe place to land." "You gave her far more than that," Julia's father said. "You gave her hope when she had none. That's a precious gift." They stayed in Ohio for 3 weeks before making the long journey home to Washington Territory. It would be the last time Julia saw her father, who passed away the following winter, but she was grateful for the chance to say goodbye and to show him that she had found happiness after all. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and celebrations. James grew into a tall, serious boy who loved helping his father with the ranch work. Alice was curious and bright, devouring every book she could get her hands on and asking endless questions about everything. In 1890, Julia gave birth to their third and final child, another son they named William, who proved to be the most mischievous of their children. By the mid-1890s, the ranch had become one of the most successful in the area. Yates had expanded the herd significantly, and they had built a larger house to accommodate their growing family. Julia's teaching had evolved into running the school in Kennewick, a position she loved and excelled at. One evening in 1895, 17 years after that cold November night when Julia had appeared shivering in his barn, Yates and Julia sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset. James, now 16, was out checking on the cattle. Alice, 12, was inside helping William, 5, with his letters. The sounds of their children's voices drifted out through the open windows, and Yates felt a profound sense of contentment. "You remember what you said to me that first night?" Yates asked, taking Julia's hand. "Please don't send me back." 4 words that changed both our lives. "I remember being so scared," Julia said. "I thought you might turn me away or worse, return me for the reward money. When you helped me instead, when you risked everything for a stranger, I started to believe that maybe there were still good people in the world. I remember thinking you were the bravest person I'd ever met," Yates said. Running through the freezing night in nothing but a thin dress with no plan beyond escape, most people would have given up, accepted their fate, but not you, Julia laughed softly. "I was desperate, not brave. There's a difference." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Yates countered. "Bravery is being terrified but doing what you need to do anyway. That's exactly what you did." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to indigo. Behind them, their children's laughter rang out as William said something funny. It was a perfect moment, simple and ordinary and everything they had fought so hard to achieve. "Thank you," Julia said quietly, "for everything. For taking me in that night, for fighting for me, for giving me this life. I know I don't say it enough, but I'm grateful every single day." "You don't need to thank me," Yates replied. "Loving you, building this life with you, it's been the greatest privilege of my existence. If I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't change a thing." "Not even the parts where Josiah's men almost caught us," Julia teased. "Not even those parts," Yates confirmed, "because they led us here to this moment, to this life. Every hardship was worth it." Julia leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling completely at peace. The nightmares had finally stopped years ago, replaced by dreams of the future. She sometimes thought about how close she had come to dying that night, either from cold or from eventually being dragged back to Josiah. But fate had intervened in the form of a rancher with a kind heart and the courage to do what was right despite the cost. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Julia thought about all the women who weren't as lucky as she had been, who were still trapped in situations like the one she'd escaped. She had started working with a women's rights group in Portland, advocating for better protection for wives and easier access to divorce in cases of abuse. It was slow work, fighting against centuries of law and tradition, but she was determined to help create a world where other women wouldn't have to risk everything to escape bad marriages. "I was thinking," Julia said, "about expanding my work with the women's group. Maybe starting a shelter here in Kennewick, a place where women running from bad situations could go for help. What would you think about that?" "I think it's a wonderful idea," Yates said without hesitation. "We have the resources now and the space. We could convert the old barn, make it into a safe house. I'd be proud to help with something like that." "You know it would bring attention," Julia warned. People would talk. Some would say we're encouraging women to abandon their duties. Let them talk, Yates said firmly. We've never much cared about other people's opinions before. No reason to start now. Julia smiled and squeezed his hand. I love you, she said. Have I told you that today? Once or twice, Yates replied with a grin, but I never get tired of hearing it. Over the next few years, they did establish a shelter, a quiet place where women and their children could stay while working to escape abusive situations. Julia worked with lawyers in Portland to provide legal assistance, and several women were able to successfully divorce their husbands and start new lives. It wasn't easy work, and there were failures and heartbreaks along the way, but every woman they helped made it worthwhile. James grew into a fine young man and eventually took over much of the ranch work, allowing Yates to slow down as he entered his 50s. Alice went to teaching college in Portland and returned to teach alongside her mother in Kennewick. William, true to his mischievous nature, became a journalist and moved to Seattle to work for a newspaper there. In 1900, Yates and Julia became grandparents when James married a local girl named Emma, and they had their first child, a girl named after Julia. Holding her granddaughter for the first time, Julia was overwhelmed with emotion, thinking about the long journey that had led to this moment. My grandmother, she whispered to the baby. I wish you could have known what your great-grandmother survived to make sure you could exist. I promise to tell you all about it when you're older. By 1905, Yates and Julia had 5 grandchildren and were respected elders in the Kennewick community. Their story had become something of a local legend, though the details were often romanticized in the retelling. Young people would come to them for advice about love and marriage, and Julia never tired of telling them that real love was about respect, partnership, and the willingness to fight for each other when times got hard. One evening in the early summer of 1910, 32 years after that fateful November night, Yates and Julia sat on the porch of their home surrounded by their children and grandchildren. There was James with Emma and their 3 children, Alice with her husband Frank and their 2 children, and William visiting from Seattle with his new wife. The air was filled with laughter and conversation, and the smell of dinner cooking wafted from the kitchen. Looking around at the family they had built, the life they had created together, Julia felt tears prick her eyes. It had been a long journey from the terrified young woman shivering in a barn, but every step had been worth it. What are you thinking about? Yates asked softly, noticing her emotional expression. About how blessed we are, Julia replied. About how that scared girl in your barn could never have imagined all of this. About how grateful I am that you were the one who found me that night. Fate, Yates said simply. It was always meant to be you and me. Do you really believe that? Julia asked. That we were meant to find each other. I do, Yates said. Out of all the barns in Washington Territory, you found mine. Out of all the men who could have discovered you, it was me. That's not coincidence, that's destiny. Julia smiled and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. Around them, their family laughed and talked and lived the lives that Yates and Julia's courage had made possible. It wasn't the life Julia had dreamed of as a girl. It was so much better. Because it was real, built on love and sacrifice and the determination to create something beautiful from the broken pieces of the past. As the sun set on another perfect day, Julia leaned against her husband's shoulder and whispered the words she had said so many times over the past 32 years. I love you, Yates Vernon. And I love you, Julia Vernon, Yates replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Every day, more than the day before, for the rest of our lives. Their grandchildren played in the yard as the stars came out, and Yates and Julia sat peacefully together, two souls who had found each other in the darkest of times and built a love that would last forever. The scared woman in the barn and the rancher who saved her had become a love story for the ages, proof that even in the hardest times, hope and love could prevail. Years continued to pass gently, and the Vernon family continued to grow and prosper. Yates and Julia grew old together gracefully, their hair turning silver but their love remaining as strong as ever. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1929, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, in a celebration that brought together the entire Kennewick community. Standing before their assembled family, Yates raised his glass in a toast. To my wife Julia, who taught me that love is not about possession but about partnership, who showed me that the strongest people are often those who have survived the worst, who gave me a life beyond anything I could have imagined when I was a lonely rancher working his land alone. You are my heart, my soul, my everything. Julia stood beside him, tears streaming down her weathered but still beautiful face. And to my husband Yates, who saw a shivering stranger in his barn and chose compassion over caution, who risked everything to help someone he didn't know, and then stayed by my side through every battle that followed. You gave me back my life and then made it worth living. I love you more today than I did 50 years ago, and I'll love you even more tomorrow. They kissed to the applause and cheers of their family, two people who had beaten impossible odds to find happiness together. As the celebration continued around them, Yates pulled Julia close and whispered in her ear, "Best decision I ever made, helping you that night." "Best decision I ever made, trusting you," Julia whispered back. They had built something extraordinary from the ashes of Julia's first marriage. They had created a family founded on love rather than obligation, a home filled with laughter rather than fear, a legacy that would continue for generations. And it all started with 4 desperate words in a cold barn on a November night. "Please don't send me back." Yates Vernon hadn't sent her back. Instead, he had given her a future. And Julia had given him her heart, her trust, and a lifetime of love that proved some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. As the celebration wound down and their family slowly departed, Yates and Julia found themselves alone on the porch once again, in the same spot where they had sat countless times over the past 5 decades. The night was warm, the stars bright overhead, and everything was peaceful. 50 years, Julia marveled. It feels like both forever and no time at all. I know what you mean, Yates agreed. I can still remember exactly how you looked that night in the barn, so small and scared and brave. And I can remember every important moment since then, every smile, every tear, every triumph and struggle. Do you have any regrets? Julia asked. Not a single one, Yates replied immediately. Do you? Julia thought for a moment, then shook her head. No. Even the hard parts, even the scary parts, they were all worth it because they led us here. I wouldn't change any of it. They sat together under the stars, two souls who had found each other against all odds and built a love that would echo through generations. Their story would be told and retold by their descendants, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and love that refuses to quit even when the world says it's impossible. In the end, that was their greatest legacy, not the ranch or the land or the material things they had built, but the proof that love can triumph over cruelty, that kindness can change lives, and that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is offer help to someone desperately in need. As they finally stood to go inside, Julia paused to look back at the barn where their story had begun. It was still standing after all these years, weathered but solid, a silent witness to the night that changed everything. Thank you, she whispered to the barn, to fate, to whatever force had guided her to this place so long ago. Then she took her husband's hand and walked into their home, into the warmth and love they had built together, ready for whatever time they had left, knowing it would be spent in perfect contentment with the person who had seen her at her lowest and loved her anyway. Their love story had started with desperation and fear, but it had blossomed into something beautiful and lasting. And as they settled into bed that night, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been for 50 years, both Yates and Julia knew that they had been blessed beyond measure. The scared woman in the barn and the cowboy who found her had written their own ending, one filled with love, family, and the quiet joy of a life well lived together. And that was the best happy ending anyone could ask for.